Welcome.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, wir sind jetzt schon am letzten Programmpunkt für den heutigen Tag angekommen. Und Sie hören jetzt gleich eine Podiumsdiskussion, wo es geht um den Spagat zwischen Schutz und Nutzen von UNESCO-Welterbestätten als Destinationen des nachhaltigen Tourismus. Und moderiert wird der Workshop von Herrn Rüdiger Strempel. Ich würde ihn gerne kurz vorstellen. Herr Strempel ist Head of the Common Wadden Sea Secretariat und seit vielen Jahren ist er dem internationalen Meeresumweltschutz in verschiedenen Funktionen treu. Nach seiner Arbeit als Referent im Europareferat des Bundesministeriums für Umwelt, Naturschutz und Reaktorsicherheit war er die ständige Vertretung Deutschlands bei der Europäischen Union in Brüssel. Anschließend übernahm er dann als Exekutivsekretär die Leitung des Sekretariats des Übereinkommens der Vereinten Nationen zur Erhaltung der Kleinwale in der Nord- und Ostsee, des Nordatlantiks und der Irischen See. Er ist jetzt seit rund 15 Jahren schon in verschiedenen Funktionen für die Vereinten Nationen tätig. Und außerdem arbeitet Herr Strempel als Journalist, Übersetzer und als Autor. Und ich würde jetzt gerne an dieser Stelle an Sie übergeben, Herr Strempel. Wir freuen uns sehr auf die Podiumsdiskussion.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I can't see you, I hope you can see me. Thanks for being here on this reasonably late Friday spring afternoon in Berlin. We hope we won't disappoint you. We're happy to have you here, and we think we're going to have a very interesting panel discussion. Interesting for two reasons, because on the one hand, I think we're dealing with an interesting subject, and even though the title of our panel discussion today is not very snappy, and I myself have to read it because I can't remember it by heart, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, Irreplaceable Treasures, Benefits Beyond Borders, ? I think it's a very relevant and a very topical issue because we'll be dealing with topics that are of interest both to those of us in the conservation community and, of course, to those of us dealing with tourism issues. It's also going to be interesting because we have a group of very interesting panelists here, and I'd like to ask them to come on stage now, and then I'd like to introduce them to you. Maybe, ladies and gentlemen, if you join me up here, I'm supposed to sit on the left. Thank you very much. So starting from left to right, we have Mr. Malcolm Bell, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Visit Cornwall in the United Kingdom. We have Jaap Verhulst from the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs, which is also the ministry in the Netherlands dealing with nature conservation issues, and therefore also somebody I'm quite familiar with because he also deals with Wadden Sea issues because he's also the ambassador of the Dutch government to the northern regions of the Netherlands. Mr. Jaap Verhulst, Dr. Christiane Paulus from the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, and I'm not going to go into this now because it's a very long name, it'll take a lot of time, generally referred to as BMUB, which is much briefer, and maybe we can stick to that in the course of our discussion here today. Dr. Paulus is Deputy Director of Nature Conservation Issues in the Ministry. Next to her we have Dr. Birgitta Ringbeck, who is the focal point for UNESCO World Heritage Germany in the Federal Foreign Office. Professor Stefan Winghardt, who's President of the Office for the Conservation of Monuments of the state of Lower Saxony in Germany from Hanover, and he's also a board member of ICOMOS Germany. And finally, we have Peter de Bruijn, who's with the UNESCO World Heritage and Sustainable Tourism Program with UNESCO in Paris, France. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here today. And I will now sit down. I hope you can still see and still hear me. I'd like to quickly explain to you how we're going to go ahead with this. I'll say a few very, very brief introductory words, and then I'd like to address some questions to our panelists, to individual panelists or groups of panelists. Followed by that, we're going to have the actual panel discussion, in which I will ask questions and ask all the panelists to answer as they feel they should or would like to answer. So What are we talking about here? We're talking about World Heritage, and World Heritage, of course, is about conservation, but World Heritage Sites, as you all know, are also prime tourist destinations. And that means that on the one hand, they can contribute to sustainable development and to community involvement, to community prosperity, but on the other hand, they're also at risk. And in using them as tourist destinations, we must be sure not to compromise the outstanding universal value, which is the reason why these sites are, in fact, UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And our panelists today will examine these two aspects, using these sites as tourist destinations, but also safeguarding their outstanding universal value, and how these two aspects can be reconciled. And I'm hoping for some interesting examples actually from daily life and from not the ideal world, but the real world where this has been successfully done. But we can also, of course, examine some of the potential pitfalls and some of the dangers that we're faced in doing this. I'd like to begin with a few introductory questions, as I said. And I have one question which I'd like to address to Dr. Paulus, Professor Winghart, and also Malcolm Bell. You've seen our title. As our title indicates, World Heritage Sites are irreplaceable treasures. But they also attract considerable numbers of tourists. And what I'd like to ask you very bluntly is, does this influx of tourists sometimes worry you? Maybe we could start with Dr. Paulus.
Yes, thank you, Rüdiger, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, does it worry me? No. It's of course true that many World Heritage Sites are visited by a lot of tourists. They are a major tourist attraction, but we have to have a very differentiated approach. Some of the sites would have been visited by tourists anyhow, despite if they are World Heritage Sites or not, and there are also other World Heritage Sites who are not accessible to tourists, yeah, because of natural inaccessibility like islands, or because of other regulations like the Mount Athos in Greece, where there are restrictions to visit them. Anyway, I think first of all, the high number of tourists is a sign for appreciation of the site. So I think first of all, we have to look at it very positive. But of course, and I think we will go further on it, there are cases where uncontrolled mass tourism has damaged the site, like Machu Picchu or Pompeii. But the thing is, I think we have to deal with it by good and well-planned management. And that is, to my understanding, the key success tool to balance this delicate issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Winghart, are you worried?
Yes, thank you. So I think I'm very near to you. So related to cultural monuments, I do not worry in general. I think as you did, it's depending from the quality and the strictness of the management. Of course, there are some World Heritage Sites which are not to visit or to be visited by very, very few visitors, as for instance, for example, the Lascaux caves, which are very badly damaged. But in fact, I think there is a wide range of variability from no one up to no worrying at all. I think, in fact, it's really a matter of the management and of the strictness and also really of the quality. You mentioned Pompeii. So we have a good law, we have a management plan, but I think the perseverance of the management is not as good, and therefore the damages in Pompeii are disastrous. So you can see what can happen if you don't have a strict management.
Thank you. Mr. Bell, as the Chief Executive Officer of Visit Cornwall, of course, you want to attract tourists, but do they sometimes worry you as well, or don't they?
I think they can. I think there can be a worry, but I think we're, like a lot of tourist boards now, are very signed up to sustainable tourism. And sustainable tourism has many definitions, but one to mine is that you take a responsible use of the assets you have, and World Heritage Sites at the top of that asset, and you look at how that can be of economic and social benefit for centuries going forward, and certainly decades. So the best thing a tourist board can do is work on visitor management and communications so that there can be honeypots where people can enjoy part. Other parts of sites have to be protected. But it would be a foolish tourist board who destroyed the asset that was attracting visitors. So they're probably World Heritage Sites, and one of the only assets that you know have literally centuries of value in them if they are protected, maintained, and enhanced. So I think it would be irresponsible of any tourist board not to do it. So I think it has to be done on a site-by-site basis. You have to do active visitor management, but that can actually help in many, many ways. And I think also has to take into account the local communities that surround often or are part of a World Heritage Site, because they're part of the attraction. So although it might mean limiting visitation and visitor numbers in the short term, it's for the greater long-term gain of the local area.
Thank you very much. My second question today goes to Dr. Ringbeck and Peter de Bruyn. The second part of our title, we just referred to the first part, the second part of our title mentions benefits beyond borders. Can you name some examples of World Heritage Sites that deliver such transboundary benefits? Dr. Ringbeck, to begin with.
Yes, of course. I think I could name a lot of them, but I think I'm not sitting here to name only a lot of them. But of course, there are benefits about this. Or the World Heritage, first of all, is not only about conservation, it is about international cooperation, and that is a value on its own. And I think to share experience and to develop common approaches, for instance, in regard to sustainable tourism, enrich and enhance our work. And therefore, of course, there are benefits beyond your borders beside financial benefits or economical benefits. So I think, and we have to use the World Heritage Convention, first of all, of course, as a forum and as a convention for sustainable development and conservation, but we have to use the convention also as a tool of communication, of worldwide communication. And that is maybe not a material benefit, but it is a benefit how to cooperate together in the global world.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, just to really echo what Dr. Ringbeck said, it's an interesting thing happened at the last General Assembly of the World Heritage Convention, and there's now a policy on sustainable development. So it's directly linking back to the convention. And I think what we are seeing this idea of international cooperation and those benefits from that. For example, there's the World Heritage Site of Victoria Falls. It's a transboundary site between Zambia and Zimbabwe, and those two countries have that the site is actually managed. They have a conservation management plan, so they manage the site quite well together. But on tourism, it's not. It's a bit fragmented, and they're starting now to realize that there are benefits of looking at that World Heritage Site as a destination, as one destination, and getting the benefits from one side to the other side. And they were testing a new visa system, for instance. And so there was before you would have to get 2 visas if you wanted to cross the bridge to go from one side of the falls to the other. And now they have a one visa system. So I think these kinds of developments and these kinds of benefits are really tangible. And another site in the U.S., again, looking at this international cooperation, Glacier National Park and the Waterton in Canada. And this was many, many years ago. It was one of the first peace parks in the world. And again, sort of using World Heritage to promote peace, I think is a real tangible benefit from World Heritage inscribed sites.
Thank you very much. Would you like to add something? You're looking at me like you'd like to add something. No. Okay. Okay, my next question goes to Mr. Verhulst, who is with the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs, as I said. He is, however, also a member of the board of the Dutch World Heritage Sites, and he is the head of delegation of the Netherlands to the trilateral Wadden Sea cooperation. And that's why I'd like to ask you something about the Wadden Sea, actually, because very specifically about the Wadden Sea, which of course is also close to my heart. In what way does the World Heritage status generate benefits beyond borders for the Wadden Sea region or through the Wadden Sea region?
Yes. Well, I think it is, when it comes to tourism, it's all about quality and it's not about quantity. The Dutch Wadden Sea, but I think that's the same in Germany and Denmark. We have a lot of tourists on the islands. And for the Dutch situation, let's say, if all the accommodation is full, then the islands are not still, very nice to visit. But World Heritage Site is about experiencing this special place and learning about how important it is, and bringing about these values front stage and deriving extra support for this area. That's the main advantage of being a World Heritage Site. And talking beyond borders, I think that the Wadden Sea earns a lot more attention globally spoken. I think that the National Geographic reader elsewhere in the world is potentially interested in the Wadden Sea. And having this World Heritage certificate now, I think we are better able to bring the Wadden Sea on the world stage, so to say. So that is important, and it's also important when you look at the trends in, let's say, in tourism, that you see an increase of nature-based tourism, ecotourism, and so on. And we should be in the midst of it. So that's also something where we can profit from, since we are World Heritage, that we come on the stage and that everybody knows how important these areas are for the world, for the animals, and also for, let's say, for next generations. That, I would say, that's the main benefit from World Heritage, from the label World Heritage Site of the Wadden Sea.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bell, Cornwall is a World Heritage area, but it's not a transboundary area, and yet, do you think it generates transboundary benefits?
Yes, the Cornwall Mining World Heritage Site celebrates and recognises over 2,500 years of mining, and very much deep rock mining, and was the centre for Europe of tin, copper, from Phoenician times, actually, all the way through to only about 50 years ago. And it's got, there was an expression for quite a long time, if there's a deep mine in the world, you'll find a Cornishman at the bottom of it. So there are 53 territories in the world of mining, which are actually supported by the technologies and the people of Cornwall. So that's creating an amazing network from Portugal, Sardinia, Poland, all across to Australia, North America. And those 53 areas now very much are a community in their own right. And not only, I think, generate tourism and visits and interest in the industrial heritage, but it also enables it to link to industrial heritage trails, but also helps actually some of those other areas to appreciate and treasure their industrial past. So there are a lot of connections. There's a lot of twinning between Cornwall and Mexico. There's a traditional dish in Cornwall called the pasty, which was invented by miners, so it's actually more made in Mexico than Cornwall. So there are now a lot of global connections to the mining heritage site as much as European connections. And I think it's that issue of when you get recognition of an asset, it helps other parts to recognise their assets, even if they're not a World Heritage Site, and to create that power that comes from working with others.
Thank you very much. So I think, to briefly sum up, it seems that there is unanimity that these transboundary benefits do exist, and World Heritage Sites can contribute to those. I'd now like to move on to the questions which I'll address to the entire panel. So any one of you who would like to answer, please feel free to do so, and please answer. We had a pre-meeting here which made it clear that we all have a lot to say about this. I'm not allowed to say anything, but all the others are. So I'd like to open the floor. My first question is, we know that World Heritage Sites can make a notable contribution to sustainable development, and I'd like you to give me some examples of where this has actually happened. First come, first served. Maybe you'd like to start.
Well, I think one of the types of World Heritage Sites where there's a real demonstrable benefit is cultural landscapes. I mean, cultural landscapes in and of themselves, they're living landscapes. So there are people living within the World Heritage Site, and I think those cultural landscapes, you know, really demonstrate that benefit. And I mean, we have cultural landscapes, you know, throughout the world. There's, I mean, here in Europe we have, or just in Germany, the Rhine Valley, for instance. That's a cultural landscape where I think you can really demonstrate the benefits to sustainable development. In Norway, there's the Vega Archipelago, and that case in particular is very interesting because they've created a product based on the natural heritage that exists there, and the way that they take it's a migratory route for ducks, and they house them and take care of them, and the way that they harvest the feathers is very unique and it's been going on for, you know, centuries and centuries, and these are probably some of the most, I would say, the most expensive duvets in the world come from the Vega Archipelago. So the benefits are very tangible for those communities, and how they utilize that, and it really is part of the identity of those communities. And I think it's really important, you know, this idea of cultural landscapes and the people that live in them. They are the stewards of that heritage, and they have been, in many cases, for centuries, the stewards of that heritage. So there's that direct connection to the World Heritage Site. There's that sense of pride and place that we so much want to demonstrate through tourism. That, you know, that there is that feeling and that connection, and the on the conservation side, the communities coming together to preserve and conserve these sites because they're getting some benefit from that, and there's some tangible benefit from that. And I think the ideas of local communities and cultural landscapes is key, and it links to tourism, but it links to many other things. And again, demonstrating that link to sustainable development is fairly obvious. It creates networks, cooperation, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Well, in that regard, certainly cultural landscapes are in many ways similar to natural World Heritage Sites, of course, because you have similar issues and similar topics there. Professor Winghart, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I could add another example. For instance, it is worth noting, for instance, that in Bamberg the cost of preservation and restoration of the site is viewed less as a negative element, which is normal. For instance, preservation is regarded as expensive, but in Bamberg they turned it around, and because of the significant economic activity generated in and for the town as a result of the work undertaken, for instance, in Bamberg, as a restoration preservation sector that is worth about 50 million euro per annum. In short, the skills and market provided by the World Heritage Site has created a sector that exports skills and services across Germany, resulting in a revenue benefit for the city itself. So conservation, especially conservation of historic buildings, is a market, is a local market. It is not a European-wide market. And there, of course, the towns and the local small companies, they benefit of the work, of the restoration work, which is necessary to keep the OUV in such a town, because you have to, you cannot work with huge companies. You have to work with the skilled workers on the local and regional level. And of course, conservation and protection of heritage is an integral part of sustainable development.
Thank you.
Can I make one
Sure.
clarification for the folks in the Vega archipelago in Norway? It's actually geese, not ducks. They're geese, not ducks. I said they were ducks, but they're geese.
Malcolm Bell, I think you raised your hand, so
Yes,
please.
I did. Our World Heritage Site is 10 years old, and the one nearest to us in south of England on the Jurassic coast is only about 15, 16 years old. The one thing I've observed is that when they were just protected areas and not World Heritage Site, they are actually almost seen as a barrier to development of tourism. But when they become World Heritage Sites, they really get recognised as an asset and a benefit for the development of an area. So you do get that sort of change, which I think then actually starts to get people thinking about sustainability and responsibility, about looking after what we have and working with it, rather than seeing it as a barrier.
Right. Okay, thank you. Professor Winghardt.
Yeah. Of course, Mrs. Ringbeck is completely right. The awareness of the cultural importance of it in the World Heritage Site is the basis for sustainability, and this cultural awareness needs protection. So this is both sides of a medal. For instance, look at you said Bamberg, so I say it for my region. I say it for Goslar. There's a World Heritage Site. You have to protect it. For instance, to keep the big malls out of the city. If you keep them out, the tourists are fond of a beautiful medieval and a mountaineer city like Goslar is, and they come. You need money to afford sustainability, and you will find that by a sensible tourism. So I think protection and economic success is mutual. You need both of that, and therefore I think protection, tourism, and sustainability just belong together. You need this, and all together they are based of, for instance, a ground-bound craftsmanship, for instance. So the money stays in that region and doesn't go to international or maybe far remote building firms and so on. So it's just the money keeps in that region, and you have to take it for sustainable aims and targets. And I think it's just a system, and that shouldn't be broken.
Thank you. Dr. Paul is looking at the natural side of things. What will you say?
I would like to say, to echo what Malcolm has said, nature protected sites are often seen as a barrier, and World Heritage Sites are seen as a chance. But I think one has to be very careful about that, because when one goes originally to what was meant with the World Heritage Convention, it is about protection and about keeping the site and about keeping the outstanding universal value. And then when it comes to a listing of a site, I think it's very important that the site and the local communities and the governments and the authorities, whoever is involved, have a clear vision on where they want to go with that site. Yeah? They really need to think, do we want to have more tourists? Do we want to have no tourists? Do we want to have other tourists coming? And how can we keep the integrity of the site? And after that self-defining process, I think one should develop and one should carry out analysis, should be very clear about what obstacles are there in terms of sustainable development, and I think it's also of utmost importance that it's from the beginning together in a dialogue with all the partners that are involved in the development of the site. Yeah, and from the governmental point of view, I would like to say that this World Heritage Tourism Strategy is a very good example for that, because we, all partners, sat together for almost 2 years and were discussing in a bigger project about how to develop the World Heritage Site Wadden together with our neighbors, Netherlands and Denmark, and ended up in an action plan. And I think this is a very good example, but of course not many countries are in that position that they can do it from the scratch, from the listening, but it's a good case, I think.
Thank you. That was a German view. We don't have a representative of Denmark here today, but we do have a Dutch representative. Mr. Verhulst, would you like to add to that?
Yes, well, most things are said, I would say. Yes, as I already said, it's all about quality, and it's. I think we are in the Wadden Sea. We have a well-managed area, so we have zones and so on, and you know the accommodations are outside the Wadden Sea, so the direct damage we don't have to be very. We don't think we'll see that. It's about what kind of development is feasible and is also appropriate in the, as Frau Paulus already said. And to my opinion, it's very much tourist, use of tourists, which is very nature related. You know, it is a great experience walking on the stretched sandbanks of the Wadden Sea and experience the space and seeing all the birds there. And it's also nice having a guide with you who knows a lot of that and who also knows a lot about the tides, for example, which is very important. So what you really need is capacity building around this nature-oriented tourism, which is a real unique selling point for the Wadden Sea. And I would say this is a type of sustainable growth and sustainable development, which is very appropriate for this area. And to my opinion, it could grow even further. And then you have and sustainable growth, and it's also adding value to. It's giving more contribution, more support from the people to protect it, and it's also giving economic growth in this area. So I would say it's having this World Heritage certificate now gives us this really good chance, and that's the direction I would say we should go in when it goes to sustainable growth. Thank you. We've heard a lot of important things now, but we've heard two key words here. One is sustainable development, and the other is involving the people, involving stakeholders. When we talk about sustainable development, of course, we're talking about three dimensions. There's an economic dimension, there's an ecological one, and a social one. These three need to be reconciled, which sometimes is easier said than done, of course. Now, to do this, we have to achieve a status where local communities are involved and where the ecosystem also benefits. And I'd like to ask you, how do you think that can be achieved? And I'd like to start with Malcolm Bell.
Okay. As a tourism body, I said earlier on, we're quite committed to sustainable tourism, but nobody quite knows what that sometimes means. So we tend to use the nomenclature of VARB, which is, if I explain it, and then I'll go back to what it means. It's one that it's visitors, starts with a V, and the visitors should enjoy, respect and value and share with the local community what they've come to enjoy. So that's where visitors become part, not impose or not impact. The A stands for assets, and they can be environmental, cultural, built or natural. And that's sustainable tourism, about protecting them and improving on occasions. And I think some of that is about integrity and authenticity. So that's that part. Residents, who actually accept and welcome and see the tourist as a contributor to improving their area in their life. So I think that's about involving residents. And the last one is obviously about businesses, which is they have to be profitable, but they should again be engaged in the supporting of the assets of which they make an economic contribution. So I just wanted to explain that, because I think when you start talking about World Heritage Sites, that actually should be the heart of where those models work best and be the beacons of where sustainable tourism should be more developed in other areas. So for the World Heritage Site in Cornwall, That means involving local communities. When I was a young man, I'm now 60, so that was a long time ago, the mining sites were seen as somewhere you went to dump anything. So if you had anything dead or alive sometimes, but lots of other things just went down a mine shaft, and they were used for dumping cars, dumping waste. They were just seen as wastelands. Now you see that not only visitors and residents really value those sites and don't see them as a dumping ground, but part of that's about the community, the local community. They were probably more damaging on the sites than actually visitors. The second part then is obviously around looking at those assets, and they are also ecological systems. So again, it's building around that in particular, and engaging the residents in understanding the value, but also businesses. So we've done quite a lot with businesses, but it is around that very particular asset, which is repeating myself, is if we do all these things, we'll have an economic and social value from the assets for centuries. And I think that's at the heart of sustainable development.
Thank you. Peter, looking from, well, what may appear the lofty heights of UNESCO, how would you see this?
Well, I think obviously, and we're all, I think, in agreement on this. The connection for World Heritage and sustainable development actually is tourism, because it does cross. If it's a natural site or a cultural site, it's a very tangible way to get those economic benefits to the communities. Obviously, for UNESCO, we really want to see the revenue from tourism not just going to local communities, but also supporting conservation. And I think that's an important aspect of the sustainability of tourism that needs to plow back some of those resources. And I really think the only way you can truly achieve that sustainable development is through proper management and planning, and I think you're going to probably hear that throughout the panel about the importance of management and planning in terms of tourism, and striking that balance so it does realize and the real benefits for sustainable development. And obviously local communities are key to that. I mean, they're the stewards of that heritage, but they're also a very, very integral part of it. And understanding the constraints and needs to achieve that is critical. And again, it gets back to management and planning. And it also is a way to identify new opportunities and innovation and creativity, and how we can go about this. Because the reality is, for the public sector, certainly the resources are shrinking. They're not growing. Budgets are shrinking for conservation. So we need to realize that. And there's a lot of good examples of World Heritage Sites doing that and bringing that innovation in ways that are achieving that and achieving that sustainable development. So I think, providing these types of incentives is really the future for this, to really again sort of to realize the true benefits from tourism, and in terms of conservation and the well-beings of the communities.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ringbeck, I saw you note something down, which makes me assume you'd like to react to something that was just said.
Okay, first of all, as the cultural experts, I have to insist not to forget culture as a crucial component of sustainable development. For me, it's clear. We need culture in the widest sense is necessary to ensure that local communities could benefit from World Heritage status. In example, a comprehensive culture of communication, cooperation, as well as participation, is a precondition for the involvement of local communities and the development and implementation of a master plan for sustainability. And I like to open a little bit the field. Perhaps we are watching and we are shocked at the moment by seeing what happens in the Middle East, and that our treasures are destroyed at the moment. And I'm deeply convinced that heritage means identity, and we need this identity more than ever. I think if we are looking, and we will hopefully very soon have our 0 hour, and I think the common heritage and how to react on these terroristic acts will unite us and will help to overcome borders, I think, in the post-conflict times. And for instance, I like to underline that Germany and Iraq, a Western country and a Muslim country, we put forward last summer to the General Assembly of the United Nations a resolution which condemns the destruction of heritage as war crime. And the Bonn Declaration at the last World Heritage Committee meeting underlines this, that we need a common culture and a common understanding of culture for us and, of course, for the future generation, as well as a basis for a sustainable development, especially in regions, in post-conflict regions. And I think that we have to keep in mind that we are confronted and challenged with huge new approaches for sustainable development in past conflict areas. And I think heritage, and especially the World Heritage Convention with its sites and with a common understanding and with a common acknowledgement of this culture, will help us to overcome borders, hopefully in the nearest future.
Thank you very much for that. And to also come back to the issue of local communities, of course, we're talking about countries here where possibly local communities are even more dependent on the benefits from these World Heritage Sites than they might be in more affluent countries of Europe, for instance. So it's a very important aspect. Professor Winghart, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah. So I think the most of these things are said by Dr. Ringbeck. So for its idea, cultural heritage is international, and cultural heritage is connecting. Maybe also in transnational boundaries, in transnational cultural heritage. Think for the frontiers of the Roman Empire, which is not in the Near East, but it's in Europe. It connects the countries of the Netherlands and Germany and also Austria and the Danube countries with England, or maybe the Neolithic palafids, the wet ground settlements around the Alpine region, which brings together a region which once was very close and is now divided by several languages. So I think internationally, the international character is really necessary, and we should pronounce that very well. So in fact, I think we're going to the last question now, or
feel free to carry on if there's something you'd like to add. I'm going to still stay with this question for some time because I have two more panelists I'd like to sort of prod to answer. But if you have something to add, please do so. Not at the moment?
Not at the moment, yes. Okay. So I think you just go further on, and then we can do that.
Thank you. Mr. Verhulst, speaking about local communities, and I'm interested in your experience, not only, of course, with the Wadden Sea, but also with Dutch World Heritage Sites in general, which you're dealing with. In what way are you involving local communities, and are they benefiting? Is this playing out well?
Well, yes, I think we when you look at let's say the Wadden Sea, the Dutch Wadden Sea, but I think it's also the German and the Danish Wadden Sea, we have been very busy protecting this area. For it's been a period of about 25 years that we've been making policies that it's well protected, and with the crown on it, that was the World Heritage Site. And these areas are traditionally visited a lot by people, and people enjoy it very much. And we're now in a stage that I would say that we should involve the people from the islands and, let's say, the local communities more Not so much that we think this legal protection is the basis of all. We cannot give in, or we cannot get in the situation of trade-offs, but we should now, we are now in the process to more involving the local communities, because I don't know how it is in other parts of the world, but it is also sometimes so that it's all sort of thrown over the local communities, all these protection laws and so on. And we're now in a situation that the local communities are becoming more and more proud that they are in the Wadden Sea area. And this is a cultural thing, you know, being proud, living there, and benefiting from it, but also supporting it. That's the next step, and we do have the policy now to more involve the local communities, just to set a step further in, for example, the sustainable growth, or also when it comes to we've got a lot of hotels, a lot of visitors there, but as I already said, it's important for the people who are on the Wadden Sea that they get to know how important nature area it is. So this is also a matter of capacity building. It's capacity building for the guides, it's capacity building in the hotels, and so on and so on. So we have to work together and become partners, so that we're sort of setting a step forward in quality towards what the Wadden Sea is all about. And we think the government has to take his responsibility, and it has to be well managed and well organized. We have to have zones where you can come and zones where you cannot come because of protection things. But it's also necessary that the local and regional communities support to the area by knowing where they are, you know, and explaining to the people who are there, and so on and so on. So that's the story, and I think it should be, that's the major challenge for the next coming period to achieve that, and that's what we need. That's what we are doing with the local communities, and of course, if they should also earn an honest, they should also have a good life of that, a prosperous life. That's all within the deal.
Thank you. Dr. Paulus, environmental protection is in many ways a popular issue, and it's reasonably easy to rally support for environmental protection, but when it comes to the practicalities and to day-to-day life, sometimes people suddenly say, but not in my backyard. Your ministry knows this because, of course, in the course of the energy transition, you have a problem with power lines. People agree with renewables, but they don't want power lines passing by their backyard, literally. So, again, how do you think we could best involve local communities? How important do you think it is to involve local communities, and what's the best approach to doing it?
Yeah, maybe to disturb a little bit the harmony here on the panel, I think being a World Heritage Site can also be a threat not only to the site but also to the communities, because their expectation is very high. The interest of the tourism sector is very high, and it might happen that much more visitors are coming. We have seen it in several sites, and that might create problems with new infrastructure coming to remote places, which is not in itself bad, but it can be a threat to the nature. We have cases in the Galapagos Islands, for example, which have been very remote and not easy to access, that invasive alien species are brought to this area because of the many people who are going now to this site. And I think one has to be very clear about what is happening when a site becomes a World Heritage Site, that it's a lot of work to become a World Heritage Site, but when you are a World Heritage Site, the work really starts. Yeah, and the dialogue and the participation, what has already been said, is the key, and also the mutual understanding, because I know that nature conservationists can be very stubborn and want to protect their site and their animals, and to put the thinking of the tourism sector on their minds can be very difficult, but in itself, I think even this exercise is a good exercise, but there have to be clear mechanisms, there have to be clear agreements and clear rules, otherwise, it can be very difficult for nature protection.
Thank you very much. I'd like to stay with you for a minute, but move on to the next question. When we're talking about conserving World Heritage Sites, we know that it can be beneficial to cooperate with the private sector, but on the other hand, there are certain risks involved as well. How can we ensure that cooperation with the private sector, with a view to actually conserving World Heritage, is mutually beneficial, and what pitfalls do you see, and how can we best avoid them?
Yeah, I think I've already spoke a little bit about it. I would like to say that it must be carried out on all levels. I think on the local level, on the national level, but I think also the UNESCO World Heritage Convention has a task in it in constantly reviewing the progress in the site, watching what is happening in the tourist sector. Is there a threat because of too many tourists coming to that site, or that the site is not managed very well? I think there are guidelines necessary from every level of policy, and I think maybe Mrs. Ringbeck would like to say a few more words on that. The convention hasn't seen that from the very beginning. It was about protection, but I think in the last years they have really started working on that and have opened towards this question.
Thank you. Please.
There was no development. You have to look at the title of the convention, and the title is Convention on the Protection and of Natural and Cultural Sites of Outstanding Universal Value. It is not a convention for labeling. It is not a convention on tourism. So in the focus of the World Heritage Convention, of course, that is conservation, and that's the main issue, and that is the task which the ratifying state parties to the convention have to address. So it is, maybe it's nice to have the World Heritage label for tourism, but it is not the task of the World Heritage Convention. It is a convention on conservation. And I think this concept didn't develop in the last years. Of course, the convention is that attractive because it is a label for, it has become a label for tourism in the meantime. But we have to focus on the original scope of this convention, and that means conservation. And sometimes I have to admit it is better not to look for listing on the World Heritage Site if you keep the situation original. Sometimes you said, okay, I do not worry in regard to the management or to the management of some World Heritage Site, but I watched that we are coming to an end. Some developments in tourism are not manageable anymore. If you go to the Taj Mahal, it's incredible. That is too much. And I think to open the doors, to keep the doors open, it is not a tool or an instrument to close the doors and declare, okay, that is our instrument to manage it. We do not open the building anymore. That is not the solution. Therefore, I think we have to face that sometimes the World Heritage label means a threat to a site.
Thank you. Professor Winghardt?
Of course, this is completely true, but I think we have to realize that the expectation of the people in the regions are not only on conservation, but also on economic success. They do have that, and I think we have to realize that. And therefore, as I said in the beginning, I think it's a real challenge to the management. The benefit has truly to be mutual. So for the protection, also as for the economic success. I think it's, I see some tendency, for instance, also here in Germany, for the tentative list now to be very, very silent about all the challenges you will have to establish a World Heritage site. There is just, I think, all the people, all the local and regional stakeholders just talk about the economic chances, and they don't talk about the duties and the challenges you will have. So, in fact, a World Heritage title is not for free. You have to do something for that, and I think that should be really fixed in a management plan. I think we have to take the view on that, and just to keep the balance between the benefits, the mutual benefit, the economic success, and the protection of the site or the monument.
Thank you. Mr. Bell, what's your view?
I think it's right to engage the private sector and the business sector, but I think this is where the balance has got to be right between the business sector supporting the preservation and development of an asset, not exploiting it. And I think that comes back to the old adage that education is better than legislation. And I think in the private sector, in a free market, and particularly with austerity and cuts to public money to support sites, there will be a drive to get more private money in, but it's got to be the balance. So, for instance, in our own World Heritage Site in the mining, thanks to European money, long may it last, despite our referendum, is that there was a big program of engaging with the private sector from micro businesses all the way through to get that appreciation of the site and the value of the site and the university and integrity of it, so that it wasn't just seen as a new widget to make commercial gain out of. It was seen as a partnership, and that meant, for instance, some of the bigger corporations were willing to put a penny a packet towards the site. A lot of smaller businesses were engaged in understanding the site and being able to be interpreters and communicators to their visitors. So it is about engaging with the hearts and minds of businesses, and hopefully money will flow, but starting with the hearts and minds, not the money. Because if it starts with the money, then you're into a commercial transaction, not a hearts and minds transaction.
Thank you. I see nodding from Mr. Verhulst. Would you agree with that?
Yes, well, I agree completely with this. And, well, you know, being a World Heritage Site is to me, it's of great importance, because we want the intention, you know, we want to let the world know how important these areas are, or these buildings are, and how important they are for the next generations too, and how important they were, you know, how the world lived, and how the history is so important. So that's a real big asset, and that also gives the obligation of a really good management, and the cooperation when it comes. If you have a house, you have an entrance and you can close a door. But for example, in a stretch, in an area like the Wadden Sea, there's a lot of local communities involved, and it is something of the heart. That's one thing. And you were talking about pitfalls. You know, we will have to deal with free riders, and we have to have a system that the overall culture is one of support and benefit also. But that's the second thing. But the overall culture should be in the local communities and in the government and so on of support and good management. And then we, of course, have to do something with the free riders. And we sort of hope that you should have a sort of a culture that free riders are, you know, are spoken to, and if the government has to do something for free riders, they should, you know, handle and do something on that. But not only the government, but also the communities. So there should also be a sort of a system in which people compete with each other how good they are with handling the area, and also pinpoint at the free riders. But that's the thing we all are responsible for, and we all have our task. And that is also some things we have to put on table and look how we are going to deal with these free riders. But most of the time, there's just a few people. So,
thank you.
The more you get the communities engaged, the more the peer group pressure reduces the number of free riders. Peer pressure is often stronger.
Yeah. We're pretty much out of time, but I'd like to give the opportunity to Peter de Bruijn to make a final remark on behalf of UNESCO, maybe to sort of wrap up our panel discussion today.
Well, I think, with to sort of capture it, I think we need a shared responsibility, perhaps, for the conservation. Because, for the convention, for UNESCO, in terms of sustainable development, in terms of tourism, our starting point, as has been said, is the conservation of these sites. That's why they're inscribed, and it's a protection. It's a legal instrument that protects these places, and I think that should always guide us. And that notion of this shared responsibility, as we engage with the communities, but also as we engage with the private sector. In that sense, if I'm going to a World Heritage Site, and I'm staying in a hotel, I'm not going to that. I'm staying in a hotel, but that's not the reason I'm there. I'm there to see the site, and so that understanding needs to be throughout that system. And I think once that happens, you will then really realize those benefits. And I think it's a very complex system. It's a very complicated system. But I think if that can be sort of how we move forward on these issues, we will make progress, and we will hopefully continue to conserve World Heritage. There is, again, as the other panelists were saying, there is different motivations for inscription. It is, there is, we have to admit that tourism is part of that now, but it's not the only thing. Some sites want to be a site for other reasons, and some of the research that has been done has really demonstrated that, that a site wants a recognition, it's a sense of pride, it's a different type of motivation, and I think that's something to keep in mind as well as we think about these things. And because, as I mentioned before, because the convention, it's not static, it has evolved, it is looking at sustainable development, and these are the challenges for the future.
Thank you very much. I was actually going to deliver a summary, but we're out of time, so I won't inflict that on you. And actually, Peter's done a good job of saying a lot of what I wanted to say anyway. So thank you very much to all of you for being here today, and thanks to you also for joining us. And for those of you who'd like to talk to some of the panelists, not all of them, some will have to leave immediately. You can visit us in Hall 4.1 at the Wadden stand. There are actually some local specialties to be had there as well, so you're very welcome. We'd like to see you there in a couple of minutes' time. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Strempel, für diese Podiumsdiskussion. Vielen Dank auch an alle Referenten, die heute hier waren, auch an das Publikum für die Teilnahme, und ich wünsche Ihnen allen eine gute Heimreise. Machen Sie es gut.